Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me. Let's chat for a bit about The Sellout by Paul Beatty. Um, this was published in 2015 in the U.S. It actually won the National Book Critics Circle Award in 2015, and then in 2016 it went on to win the Man Booker Prize. It's actually the first time an American has won the Man Booker Prize. So that was kind of cool. One thing I learned when doing a little background reading on the publication was that one of the criteria for the Man Booker Prize is that the book has to be published in the UK in English, and it this particular book they couldn't find a publisher. It was rejected 18 times in the UK before ultimately a small independent publisher picked it up. The publisher, I think, is called One World, and One World that publishing company actually published last year's winner as well. So it had two winners in a row, and it's a small publisher. So I thought that was kind of cool, and I'm glad the book finally got a UK publisher. I actually had not heard of the book until I started hearing sort of the buzz of the shortlist of the Man Booker Prize, and then I don't follow that closely typically. So then when it won, I learned a little bit more about it. And I decided to put it on my TBR because it's a social satire, and it's specifically, an American one. It's the author Paul Beatty is originally from Los Angeles, and this book is set in Los Angeles, and it is a social satire really around mainly around race and the racial relations in Los Angeles. So. I'm really glad that I went ahead and put it on my TBR to read for this year. I wasn't sure what to expect from it, but it turned out to be really good on a couple of different levels. It's funny. I believe on the cover, NPR. It's got a quote from on the cover on the edition I read. It's got a cover. NPR says a comic masterpiece. It's funny. Part of it's funny, but it's a biting satire because the underlying reality that it shows in this satire is somewhat brutal. The reality of race relations in LA, and not just LA, but by default the whole U.S. And I'm assuming this is relatable to people all around the world. The Man Booker Prize is a UK prize, so perhaps it's relatable to everyone around the world. But definitely as an American. Parts of it are pretty uncomfortable to read, although presented in a humorous way. But anyway, so what it's about, it's going to be really hard to describe what it's about. When the book opens, it's actually the main character, whose name we do not know. It's our narrator, and the narrator is known as, some people call him the Sellout. His sometimes girlfriend Marpessa calls him Bon Bon, and he says Bon Bon's the closest thing he ever had to a street name. So I'm not sure how Bon Bon would actually work as a street name, but and then he basically just refers to himself as me. So we don't actually know his name, but he is in front. And when the book opens, he's in front of the Supreme Court because he's been accused of trying to reinstituting slavery and segregation in L.A. So, that's how the story opens, and then, we actually find out how all this happened. One of the other main characters' name is Hominy Jenkins, and Hominy is an older guy that had done some work on the Little Rascals, show, movies, I guess, from like the 1930s. And so he's kind of this kind of buckwheat character, which is this really stereotyped, Hollywood stereotyped of African Americans from that era. and Hominy, really lives that part, and Hominy wants to be a slave, and actually says he is the narrator, the Sellout slave, and basically performs that function. Not because the Sellout actually wants him to, but that's Hominy himself wants to do this. The Sellout ultimately, through a series of decisions, decides to reinstitute segregation in this neighborhood of Dickens, it's called, so there's a whole process with that as well. But another main character I didn't mention early on in the book is the Sellout's dad, who is a social psychologist and is constantly doing these social experiments on him. He homeschools him, and he is his just constant sort of test subject in a wide range of social experiments that the dad does. So he has a very unusual sort of childhood in that regard. So what are my takeaways from it? I don't have a way to really describe the rest of the story, because it's just something that is not a linear story. What it really reminded me of was like a deep sea documentary, where the camera crew, they go down into the murky depths of the ocean, and they have a camera that's sort of got a light on it, but it's darkness. And then, the camera light shines on, we say, oh, there's a shipwreck, or oh, there's, some sort of strange animal. Oh, there's like a shark or whatever, So, it's sort of this camera. So it was sort of this. That's just the feel I got from this book, was like it was this camera observing the culture of Los Angeles, specifically this town of Dickens, and me as the reader was sort of the viewer of this documentary, which illustrated. So the camera was the humor, and it's shining this light on some sort of reality. So that's sort of an abstract thing, I know, to try to convey on this video, but there's not really a good way to, I don't think, to really explain the story, because the story is an observation more than a story, if that makes sense. But one thing that's sort of underlying, I felt was underlying the whole book, the whole narrative, was a certain level of violence, and this is probably I think part of the reality of the racism of LA, of the U.S. And there's one part of the book that's actually, most of it's just this low level of indifference to violence. And then there's this one time in the book where there is graphic violence, and it's actually done against an animal. The main character, the Sellout, actually has a farm. There was or maybe still was some sort of experimental farm land in a neighborhood in LA. I forgot what it was actually called. In our book, it's called Dickens. And I don't know, I read once someone was comparing the town, this is a fictional neighborhood of town of Los Angeles called Dickens, and I read that was alluding to Charles Dickens, who, the English writer from the 19th century, who wrote, social commentary. A lot of his books contain a lot of social commentaries. I don't know about that. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if the authors actually confirmed that, but this particular reviewer made that connection. Anyway, he has a farm there, and he has cattle, some cows and horses and whatnot. And there's a career day at the local school, which is he takes a calf, an 8-week-old calf, to the school, and he does a procedure to the calf that's done. I won't go into details here. That's done routinely to calves, male calves, and actually the school children love it and participate in it, and everyone's totally indifferent to this sort of violence done to the calf. And then the narrator actually then goes on to say, well, if we had time, we could do this, and names off several other things that are routinely done to cattle, which are these violent things done with no anesthetic. And, and there's this indifference to it, and to me that really illustrated graphically what we saw with the rest of sort of this social observation, this sort of violence that's going on, and yet the characters have an indifference to it, and we can see it because of our vantage point in viewing this sort of satire, and so we're set apart from it, so we can view it, whereas the characters who are living it might feel it, but I don't know, maybe they feel it, maybe they see it too, but there's a certain indifference to it I felt in the book. So, there's another part of the book that the characters go to this kind of a film, I guess, festival, and it's racist, but the people are enjoying it. So the people are going to it as if it's fun, and actually some white sorority sisters go in blackface, and I think this is alluding to something that actually did happen a couple of years ago, where a sorority was caught. They tweeted something, they were all wearing blackface or something, from like the minstrel shows. But the Looney Tunes, there's a description of the cartoons that are shown at this festival, and I recognize some of them as from when I was a child that were shown, routinely, and just racist against Asians and blacks and black people and Hispanics. So just, blatantly racist now, that I can see that now. But as a kid, they're showing it on TV. Of course, I didn't think anything about it at the time as a kid. And then it reminded me also of not that long ago, a couple of years ago, I was visiting my dad, and my dad had on TV, he had on an old Western from like the early 60s or the late 50s, and it's called Cheyenne. And I think it was Cheyenne. And in this old Western, some of the cowboys are actually doing this target practice with shooting, and they're for the target, on the tree, the paper target on the tree. It's the outline of a Native American's head, and I was like, because that's still being shown today on reruns. So, I think I did a video on this long ago about like, when does culture need to be archived, and I think these Looney Tunes cartoons need to be archived in probably the African American National Museum here that's just open in Washington, D.C., because they are definitely relics from a racist past that I don't think should still be out there feeding this sort of stereotypes. And the same thing goes for the Cheyenne episode. It's like, that's an episode, that's some, I'm not for cultural censorship per se, but there is a point in time, I think, where some culture from our past needs to be reevaluated and maybe, taken out of general entertainment and put into a different category of maybe an archive of some kind. So just a thought, but I think I'll leave it at that. I'm really glad that I went ahead and put this book on my 2017 TBR, and got it read because I wasn't sure what to expect going into it, like I mentioned, but it wound up to be very good and a very enjoyable and very sort of enlightening in a lot of ways. Even though parts of it are very uncomfortable to read, it's still a great experience, and I'm glad I read it. So until next time, take care. Bye.